So what I want to do is start out talking about common windgrass. So you guys that are from the Thumb area or even around this area have dealt with common windgrass for a long time. In fact, back in the early 90s, Dr. Jim Kells had a graduate student that worked on looking at different management strategies for common windgrass. And about 5-6 years ago, we kind of did some more work with some of the newer herbicides. And there are actually some pretty good management methods and control options for control of common windgrass. If you look at this particular weed, common windgrass is actually what we would consider more of kind of a winter annual weed because a lot of the emergence happens in the fall. Where this also is a huge problem is in Europe. And if you look at some of the literature, basically they call that particular weed, they call it silky bentgrass. And what they are really starting to see is they're starting to see a lot of resistance issues that have built up with this common windgrass that we see here in Michigan. A few years ago, we were doing quite a bit of work with this particular weed. We were looking at, okay, what are some of our best management strategies? And there are two different herbicides that kind of rose to the top as kind of some of our better control methods for common windgrass. Those were PowerFlex and Osprey. So if you start to see this particular weed as an issue, those are a couple options that we do have. A couple things we also did is we wanted to look at some different application timings. Really knowing that a lot of people like to look at frost seeding some red clover, we wanted to see if we could get by with some fall applications, particularly because this weed mostly comes up in the fall. And we actually had very good luck in trying to control this weed with fall applications of Osprey and PowerFlex. And when I'm talking about fall applications, really what I'm talking about is what we're calling kind of an early post-emergence fall application, because basically we want to make those applications when the wheat already has 2 to 3 leaves on it. And then that's when we would be making those applications. And by that time, most of that common windgrass has emerged. So Osprey and PowerFlex, some of the better options we have, fall applications work, and then early spring applications also work. Couple key characteristics that you, if you want to know how to identify this weed, one thing it does have is it has a very long ligule, which is this membranous part here. So if you tear the leaf back, it's long, it gets longer as it gets bigger, and it also becomes very jagged. As you're driving around some of your fields, take a look. If you start to see some grasses in there, and you see one that's kind of got a purplish tinge and kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a more softer look, you probably have common windgrass. So again, that's one of the weeds that we have that's, you know, it's been an issue in Michigan. It has expanded in some areas. And as growers, there are some pretty good options, and a lot of people that have this weed have been doing a very good job in trying to manage it. So as it moves into different areas, just keep that in mind. We do have some options for control. Two other grass weed species that have shown up a little bit more in some of our wheat fields are downy brome. Some people will call that cheatgrass, and then also cheat, or some people will call that chest. These are both bromous species, so they're very similar. Some of the key differences between these species is if you look at downy brome and you look at the leaf, you'll see that it's got a lot of longer, very soft hairs on it. Okay, so that's one of the key characteristics for telling the difference between downy brome and cheat. They both are going to have what we would call a membranous ligule here, and they will also have either like a fringe of hairs or it'll be a little bit more jagged. But it'll be quite a bit different than what we see for the common windgrass. So again, with the downy brome, very hairy, soft hairs. With cheat, basically there are no hairs on the leaf surface. We do see some hairs on the leaf margins. So that's some of the differences between the two. The other thing is once they start to flower or head out, you do see some differences in the seed heads. With downy brome, we see longer awns on those seed heads. You can see that here. So they're pretty easily distinguishable from cheat. So there's not those long awns. And you see that both of them will have kind of that drooping seed head. So those are some of the differences there. When we look at ways to control them, we haven't done any research on this, but looking at what others have done, PowerFlex is pretty good on the downy brome, and both PowerFlex and Osprey should be pretty good on the cheat. So I've mentioned both those herbicides. Both of those herbicides are what we would call ALS inhibitors or group 2 herbicides, and they are very good on a lot of the grasses that we do have that are showing up in Michigan.
Spring applied?
Spring applied for both of these. Yep.
Any issues with clover interseeded issues at all or not?
Okay. So with clover, if you're looking at trying to frost seed clover, you have to have fall applications of those herbicides. So spring applications, you will kill the clover. Okay. The one weed I want to spend a little bit more time talking about is roughstalk bluegrass. This is a POA species, so many of us have dealt with annual bluegrass, you know, kind of moving into the edges of our fields, in our lawns, those types of things. But roughstalk bluegrass is a bluegrass species that is a perennial species. Now, what we're seeing in our small grains is it doesn't really act like a perennial, it acts more like an annual, because with roughstalk bluegrass, one of the key characteristics from it being a perennial is it has stolons, which are basically kind of those above ground, almost like you would think of above ground roots that make it a perennial. When we start seeing roughstalk bluegrass in a lot of our small grains, we generally don't see those stolons. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about how this particular plant grows. So as I mentioned, it is a bluegrass species. One thing we had this last year, we had a large trial where we were looking at when does it come up. We wanted to know when it emerged, because if you actually look at a lot of the literature, there's not a lot of information in small grains. This weed is mostly a problem in turf situations. Okay, so we're starting to see it more in some of our small grains. One of the key things with roughstalk bluegrass is if you drive around the state right now, you can see where it's at, because right now it is this golden brown color. Okay, our wheat is green and the roughstalk bluegrass is a golden brown. So last year we did some initial work looking at trying to control it. We had a research plot all the way up in Palms, Michigan. People know where that's at, up by kind of by Deckerville. So we were driving quite a ways to do this study, and about I think it was the first part of June, I started driving back by one of the fields on campus by the dairy farm, and it was filled with roughstalk bluegrass. So this last year, we did a study and we're looking at when it comes up and what are some of the different control methods that we can use. So one thing that we did notice is this fall, we had about 85% of the roughstalk bluegrass that was going to emerge come up in the fall. There's about 15% that came up in the spring. Another thing that was very key was about on May 8th this last year, we started to see the seed heads starting to come out. By May 18th, the seed heads were fully emerged from the roughstalk bluegrass. And by June 1st this last year, it had already turned a golden brown. So it's one of these weeds that comes up early and matures very quickly. And in fact, as I was looking at some of our plots last week, I think we're already starting to see some of those seeds drop. So probably by the time harvest comes around, most of that seed is probably already dropped, and we'll kind of keep track of that. One thing that we did is we looked at some different application timings of different herbicides that we know have have activity on grass weed species. So as I mentioned before, PowerFlex and Osprey. There's also a product called Axial XL, which is what we would consider a group 1 herbicide that's kind of like a select or a Sure 2 type product where it just works on grasses only. But Axial XL you can use it in wheat without killing the wheat, and it will control the grasses. So we looked at that product. We looked at another product from out west to see if we could get good control. And basically what we saw was from our fall applications, control was okay, but again, we did have some early spring emergence, so it wouldn't be 100%. We had some early spring applications, which happened at the end of April, We had very good control with both Osprey and Axial XL. And then on May 8th, we did kind of some later spring applications, kind of at that peak stage 9 of wheat, or excuse me, peak stage 6 of wheat. And at that time, as I mentioned before, they were starting to seed out. And basically what we saw was not as good a control. And if you were to drive by those plots, you'd say, oh, they look pretty good. But if you actually dig down into the wheat, basically stunted the roughstalk bluegrass and it started to flower underneath. So again, key things, early spring applications worked well, and the two herbicides that worked very well were Osprey and Axial XL. So those are some of the things that we found out this year. Another thing I'd like to point out, a lot of you like to seed red clover. Axial XL is a grass-only herbicide, so if you're seeding red clover, that would probably be the better choice for controlling roughstalk bluegrass. So that's one of the other things that we noticed from this year. Does anybody have any questions on these grass weeds, or anybody seeing them show up a lot more? Maybe a little bit.
Those herbicides for downy, brome, and sheet there, you're applying them in the fall. Is there any soil activities or strictly contact?
These ones we would look at spring applications for control of these. Yeah, yeah.
Have you done any studies of just spraying Roundup in the fall?
So as far as just beforehand to see if we can control these?
Control something, there's little stuff growing in there.
So Roundup in the fall, if you started to have some of it emerge, you know, prior to either planting weed or before weed emergence, it would control these grass weed species. The problem is a lot of it will come up after the wheat comes up. So again, a lot of it is coming up in the fall, but it is coming up, you know, through pretty much through to November. I do want to mention one other question, or one other thing that this last week I got an email from one of our turf grass specialists, and he actually happened to notice this because he said, Christy, what's going on with a lot of these wheat fields? I'm seeing this golden brown weed. It looks a lot like bluegrass. And I said, yeah, this is one thing that we're starting to see. So for somebody from a different discipline to actually notice that some of our wheat fields are becoming a lot more of an issue, or grass weeds are becoming more of an issue, that's kind of a key thing. So it's really starting to show up a lot more. So we're going to continue to look at trying to maybe map out temperature, growing degree days. You know, this year was kind of a weird year. We had kind of a cooler spring, and just kind of see where some of this will actually, how it's coming up and how quickly. Again, it seems to mature very quickly, and we'll kind of keep an eye on that. One other thing I wanted to mention is we do have a quick study back here that we were looking at two different varieties of white wheat. We have Jupiter and we have E6012, and I don't know if Eric talked about that this morning. This is one of his newer varieties, and one of the things that he has noticed is he gets a lot more growth on that particular variety. So we're actually trying to determine whether we're getting, you know, more weed suppression, because we always say that one of the best things for weed control in wheat is to have a good wheat stand, right? If we get good canopy cover, a lot of times we may not even need to spray because those weeds just don't have an opportunity to compete. So one thing we're looking at is comparing Eric's new wheat variety 6012 to Jupiter, and you can kind of, as you look across, you can see some of the differences in growth. And one of the things that we did notice is earlier when we first came out here, it looked like Jupiter had an earlier start. It looked like, actually, I don't know if Gary's here. He goes, I don't think I planted those. He was sure he had it right? And I was sure he does, because he does everything right. But one of the things we did notice, it was a little bit slower growing in the spring, but then once it took off, it really got a good canopy. So we're kind of looking at light measurements, and we'll be looking at weed control, and we'll be taking these to yield. So those are a couple of the things. So just to see, you know, are there some wheat varieties that we can put in that are going to actually help us with weed control. So how are we on time?
Will the seed last in the soil?
That's
Is there a difference?
That's another good question. And I've looked through the literature to see if there's been a lot done on this particular weed, and there really isn't. So that's one thing we're hoping to do, is learn a lot more about this weed. If you type in roughstalk bluegrass, pretty much what you find is just what's in the turf literature, and there hasn't been a lot that's been looked at from the seed side, because in turf, they're more worried about it as a perennial spreading from those stolons. And last week when I was looking at our plots, I harvested some seed, pulled up the plant, and that's about the time we started seeing some of those stolons coming out. But usually what happens is, you know, we harvest wheat, we're doing something different, so it just doesn't seem to, you know, kind of propagate itself as a perennial in some of our cropping systems.
What about the other grass?
No-till then, or long-term no-till, would it be a big problem?
It may be a larger problem, but I think one thing that we might be doing in long-term no-till is we're using glyphosate a lot, so that's probably controlling it. So, I mean, from a weed science standpoint, it's kind of exciting because it's something different, but I know it's not from trying to come up with management strategy. So we'll continue to look at this weed and see what we can do.